Welcome to News in Context. I'm Gina Valeria. In this episode, we explore the power of language, both the words we use and the larger context of narratives and the stories we tell. My guest is Karen Yin, author of The Conscious Style Guide and founder and curator of theconsciousstyleguide.com, which has been called a timeless, indispensable guide for anyone who wants to communicate with sensitivity and compassion. So the Conscious Style Guide, before the book, which I definitely want to talk about, you pioneered this amazing space online, this just crazy, resourceful, and comprehensive website, the Conscious Style Guide. What made you decide to do that?
Gina, I am a compulsive list maker. It is just the way I think. It's the way I work. Probably it helps to supplement my memory because my brain is always like overfilled. So that extra juice has to go somewhere. So I just, as a habit, I make notes, I make lists, I just collect things. I collect information. So the Conscious Style Guide is similar to the first website that I put out, which is AP versus Chicago. It basically is my personal notes that I use in my professional life made public. And AP versus Chicago, my blog was about the differences between AP style and Chicago style. And I thought, well, if I have all these scribbled notes at work, how can I access it when I'm at home? Hey, I'm just going to put it online. And because I've been building websites of one kind or another since the 90s, it was very comfortable for me to just throw something up there. So Conscious Style Guide is different from AP versus Chicago in the sense that it's way more professional. AP versus Chicago is just me, just having fun and just being kind of kooky and irreverent. Whereas ConsciousStyleGuide.com, I really wanted this to be something that people would adopt for business use, for your publication, or even if you were a student, that you would use it to supplement your knowledge. I wanted to just be a supplemental guide because I did notice a gap. I noticed a gap between people wanting to use language more conscientiously and more inclusively and not knowing how. So that's where ConsciousStyleGuide.com came from.
Got it. I love that because what I love about it, to go back to AP versus Chicago, is that it's a it's a dry, stodgy subject. Like I can remember, and I'm a fellow nerd, like on the journey with you, but like I can remember my first time having to write an essay in a style, and I was like, oh my god, the bibliography, and oh my god, no. And you were
Yeah.
able to, like you said, make it irreverent and fun and bring some personality and life into this thing that I think a lot of students or a lot of people who have to enter into the style guide world are just like, no.
That was so fun. And I did stop blogging there after a few years, partly because I started focusing on ConsciousStyleGuide.com. But doing so brought me some kind of acclaim amongst editors and some writers. So like I will always have a warm spot in my heart for my first blog. And back then, because I started it in 2011, I think it was kind of unusual to be so irreverent about style and
Yeah.
grammar and usage. So it kind of made a name for itself.
That's so cool. There was a need because clearly people reacted and responded and were happy to be in that space. And I think you made it accessible and
Yeah.
people were able to connect with it thanks to you. So, Conscious Style Guide. Now, there are a lot of style and grammar lovers out there who wouldn't necessarily make the connection that the structural elements necessary for consistency also in that space, that there's also a need to talk about word choice toward inclusion or word choice toward thinking about the issues that you bring up in the Conscious Style Guide.
I wrote this book as a companion to ConsciousStyleGuide.com. So if you really just want to know what words to use and avoid, please go to ConsciousStyleGuide.com because that's where you will find my curated lists, often guides created by marginalized communities. outlining like how they want you to frame things, what words they want you to use. My whole goal with my book and my website and also the Conscious Language newsletter, which comes out every month, is to take the burden off of you to have to do your own research. Like, I want to make it as easy as possible for you to kind of get into the groove of thinking this way and making it like a lifestyle habit to consider the consequence, consider the context, and just know how to look things up. I wrote this book because it fills that gap between wanting to use language consciously and not knowing how, or knowing how, but you have all these feelings about language.
What do you think it is about you specifically that you were able to make that leap, recognize that need? Where do you come from in that was something you were sensitive to?
Growing up, I was always sensitive to like the language that people would use around me, especially when they used it in a way to limit me. Like, for example, saying, "Oh, you can't do that because you're a girl," or "You're too young." So it was my way of trying to gain control, like trying to understand, first of all, why does this bother me when they phrase it like this? Why do I feel excluded? And I always thought that my approach to language was actually all about logic. Like, what's the logic behind thinking that girls can't do something that boys can do? Like, where do you get that from? And that's something that I've been trying to reconcile as an editor for decades. Like, if the potential is there, why do we exclude them through this language? Of course, there are many times when excluding everybody except for a specific group is exactly what we want, because sometimes we want to give a marginalized group more attention so that we can talk about issues that are specific to them and their communities. But it's all about being conscious about word choice and the labels that we use instead of using words automatically. And it's a lot of automatic language that I'm asking people to question, like, why did you say ladies and gentlemen? What about non-binary people? What about children? Are they ladies and gentlemen? So it just helps you like activate that part of your brain that's like, oh, is this the best word? Is this most inclusive? Am I reaching the people that I want to reach? Or are they being turned off because I have inadvertently used language that made them feel like they did not belong?
That's the main reason I appreciate the Conscious Style Guide is this idea of inclusion and interrogating our own usage and really thinking about how we could do better. What are some of the real things you're proud of, at least as far as when you started this endeavor till now?
I'm really proud that when I set up consciousstyleguide.com, on the About page, I immediately talked about the importance of context and the importance of needing to understand your audience so that you can craft a skillful message. Context is not something that a lot of people who use inclusive or politically correct language think about. Sometimes people push language as if it were applicable to all situations. And that's where I and a lot of people have an issue with. In the Conscious Style Guide, I want people to kind of get away from the word level and this overemphasis on the word so that they can look at the sentence and the story and the series and basically get a sense of the bigger picture. What I tell people is all the words could be as perfect and ideal as possible, like nothing demeaning, nothing resembling a slur. Yet the story itself could perpetuate a bias. Or this story could be in a series of stories, and all of them do not put the spotlight on underrepresented people. So we don't want to be fooled by the niceness or the prettiness of a word when the story or the topic or a bigger issue is happening that we're ignoring. In fact, a lot of laws are written in a way so that it is race neutral, gender neutral, you know, very, very well written so that it doesn't appear to target any group. Yet they were designed to target groups associated with certain behaviors or actions. So we need to back out of the word level and just look at what's really happening. What is this associated with? What are the stories that I'm telling? Like, what part do they play in these historical patterns? By saying this, I'm not saying we must always change our story or narrative or word, but I am saying think about what's happening. Like, consider what the impact is if we chose another story, or if we focused on another group, or if we involved other voices, what would happen? So I think that's the first step, just being aware of how our perspectives can shift and how we can shift our audience's perspectives just by changing these elements.
Do you have an example you can share that illustrates that point, like something that people might understand?
In the media, a lot of attention is given to certain types of victims or certain types of perpetrators. If it were one story by itself, or maybe even just a string of stories, it may not be a huge issue. But if we back out of this level and we look at the stories, perhaps throughout our communities or throughout our city, state, like however far you want to back out, if we look at the coverage, who do we tend to favor and give attention to in this coverage? So it isn't the one story or the one sentence or the one word, it's the pattern that we are invoking or breaking in our choices.
Yeah, I think, Kelly McBride, who's the media ethicist at, NPR, I love her example of unarmed black man. I don't know if I'm sure you've seen that article. And I was a journalist, and I mean, I used that. I'm sure I used that phrase because it was part of the soup that we wrote in.
Right,
It was in the press release because we got that from law enforcement, which is a perspective. But if we don't recognize that as a a perspective, then we're just like unconsciously taking language from that.
right.
But wow, as soon as they tell you, oh my God, why are we saying that?
Kelly was kind enough to reach out to me to be interviewed for that article. And yeah, I really, really appreciate her addressing this because it is so common. So I backed out of this phrase and I asked myself, how did this phrase even come about? And I think it was actually intended to be thoughtful. Like, we're thinking of the Black community, but cut off from that original intent. We're still using that phrase without giving the deeper context. And I think that's where we can get into trouble, because whoever is reading it now doesn't know that this is where it came from. And also, some things, if you try to contextualize it better, like if you did try to explain the history of this phrase, in the process of explaining, we might realize, oh, this phrase makes no sense
Right.
anymore. Like, we don't need this anymore. Like, maybe it served us at one point in response to something, but not only do we not need to contextualize it, but we need to change this phrase. And that is where the solution lies.
I love that point you make about if we start explaining it, we start to realize the holes in that. There's this other phrase that I talk a lot to my journalism students about is the phrase underage woman.
Oh, yeah.
That is there such a thing? Of course not. It's a girl, it's a teen, it's a child.
Yeah.
And this phrase is used a lot when they talk about molestation cases or grown men who are accused of, and they're like, oh, he was with an underage woman. No, he was with a child.
Yeah.
And I think that too. I mean, I think that phrase came about, I don't know, but it came about because we don't want to upset the sensibilities of the listeners, right? So, because thinking about a child being harmed is just, our brains can't, it's so upsetting, but it's not helping us to not face it. I don't know. These are the things but I'd love to hear from you what you think.
Yeah, underage women, you know how I said that my approach stems from logic?
Yes.
There's something illogical about
Yes.
underage women.
Yes.
Yeah, so, like, that's like a big sign that that language should be examined. And I have similar issues with when people say second generation immigrant.
Yeah, they're an
It's
American.
American to me. Why don't you say second generation American? Why do you emphasize the immigrant part? Their parents were immigrants, but the child is not. And I'm speaking as a second generation American.
You're listening to News in Context. I'm Gina Valeria. We are talking with Karen Yin, author of The Conscious Style Guide.
Accuracy and logic and conflation, all of those are related to, like, if we just thought about it, it's like, well, that doesn't really make sense. Like, we need to make distinctions clear for many reasons. A lot of people think that if you say underage women, you are actually robbing the victims of compassion because you're saying they're complicit, that if they're women, they're adults and they must have consented in some way. So we need to pull it back and say, well, underage women are just girls and girls are not able to consent.
Yes, yes. So we talk about the response to what you've done, which is incredible. And I know that there are so many writers and journalists and out there who are so thankful and grateful to what you've done and what you're doing with the book. But also, there are people who resist this. And I can think about, I mean, I can think of a million examples in my own head. Have you gotten resistance to some of the ideas you've put forth? And I'd love to hear from you about that and how you've responded.
Oh, I have so many responses to this. So let me try to pick a few. When it comes to people being resistant to inclusive language or fair language, I do kind of make a distinction between allies or people who are hostile to the whole idea. If you're hostile to the whole idea of equity-based language, then I'm going to deprioritize that. I'm going to work with allies more because I need allies. I don't need to spend my precious time and energy trying to convert someone who doesn't believe. So this is just a lifelong practice that I have. I want to put my energy to good use, and it is not toward trying to convert people. So if an ally has resistance, I want to say, you are why I wrote this book, because I, an ally, am also resistant to some things. And I have figured out over the decades that I've been working with language consciously, I figured out ways to move my processing of language along so that it doesn't have to be an emotional thing each time. So the short answer to people who are resistant to certain language change is, don't change. Keep using your language. You don't have to adopt everything that comes along. If it does not make sense to you, what's going to happen if you do adopt it is you're going to become resentful. You're going to be resentful of language change. And worse, you might blame people who are marginalized for these changes in language instead of blaming the system and the practices that marginalize people. So if that is the consequence, I want you to just pause and just keep using that word. Move on to something else, right? You are an ally. You want to move forward. Move forward with something else while you work with the other language. You think about it, you wear it around. You may choose to not use it in the future. I still use a lot of what might be considered outdated language. Like, I still say gender bending because I don't think the new words, I don't really see a need to replace my old queer language. I'm a queer, by the way.
Right.
So I don't think that we need to jump on the latest thing. In my book, I talk about the importance of knowing yourself. And until you know yourself, you can't really ground your conscious language practice in something. So I know myself to the extent that I'm not an early adopter for anything. Okay, that's not true. If a style book comes out, I'm the first one in line to buy it. Okay.
Awesome.
I will own all the style books except for AMA. That's just too expensive. Okay. But apart from that, I don't jump on the latest thing. I don't like thinking that way. I don't like what it does to my heart to have to be on top of the latest thing. I find it draining. So because of that, I am aware of new shifts in language,
Mhm.
but I barely monitor it until it comes more into the mainstream. When it's on the edge of the mainstream, then I'm like, oh, okay, this is cool. Like, is this something that is useful for my audiences? How are people reacting to this word? Like, basically, what is the impact of this new word? How can I be more compassionate or more fair or promote liberation with this word. So I kind of put it through all these little tests before I jump on the train. I don't like being pushed and pulled, especially with language, because language is so personal. Like, give me a moment, right? So, my book, The Conscious Style Guide, is all about saying, hey, let's pause. Let's think about it. Does this fit in with your life? Does it fit in with how you work? How will your audiences receive it? Do you need to build a bridge to this language? I want people to think critically. Like, to me, conscious language, conscious is about critical thinking. It's about being aware, mindful, and intentional. It is not about, well, let's use this word because some group somewhere said this is what they want.
Oh, wow.
What group is it? Is it the group that's targeted or is it the group outside? What I see often is non-disabled people pushing this language for disability communities. This happens all the time. I want people to stop and think, where did this suggestion come from? Did it come from the community? If so, is this a widespread opinion or is it a few people? If it's a few people, are they activists? Where do they get their opinions from? Like I'm interested in all those things,
I
before I make a change.
That's something that I really, really, really appreciate about your approach. I love your approach because I think a lot of the resistors think they're being told they have to change everything about their language. And that is the assumption, I think, when someone enters, for example, your website or starts to read your book or sees your book on the shelf. And for you to be like, look, I am all about this life. I am all about conscious language. And that you have a critical approach, a contextual approach, a thoughtful approach to how you use language. Part of the resistance, not all of it, but part of it is there's a new word every week. There's a new word every day. And why? And so people just shut down. And it's like, you don't have to shut down, but we're asking you to be thoughtful. We're asking you to think critically about how your language affects others.
What I want people to know is that this book was written by somebody who does not like being told what to do and does not like telling people what to do. So all of my advice is offered with that understanding that these are things for you to consider. If you did want more options for communicating in a way that removes barriers instead of keeps them in place. Conscious language, for me, I call it language for equity because equity is about impact. So it takes the focus kind of off of intention. Like most of us use language with good intention, but sometimes it doesn't land well. Not knowing that it's going to land badly part that I want to help people with. When I say something that is misconstrued, I want to find out, well, how else could I have said that? Sometimes it is the audience not understanding, but it's always the speaker and the audience meeting midway. So I want to do as much as I can so that we can meet midway and for me to be understood.
On the thread of meeting people halfway so that we can be understood, we are in a moment, well, not even a moment, we are in a context right now in our society where we are drawing battle lines. So much polarization, so much distrust, mistrust, hate, harm that can come. And I know that, from our previous interactions and from reading your work, I know that this is something that matters to you on some level, although maybe you don't describe it exactly the way I'm describing it. How do you think this can help us work across our differences? Why you think it's so important now to have this book come out in the moment that we're in?
I have been observing over years how the best intentioned people are sometimes presenting inclusive and conscious language as a must, which has the effect of making people afraid and frustrated because nothing they say is right. At least that's how they feel. That's sometimes how I feel. I have been in spaces where the first thing they did was they had a list of language rules. And I thought, oh, this is like being in church. And I thought, I want to be able to present the joys of conscious language and not make it a chore. Like, this is what you need to do to be accepted into this community. When I talk about the consequence of language use, one consequence of trying to push inclusive language is that people will feel like nothing they do is good enough. And then my fear is that they stop trying. So part of conscious language is being skillful in the way you bring up differences in language and skillful in the way you correct people.
Yes.
For example, in the book, I talk about how between us, like if you ever said something that I found harmful or offensive, I would pull you aside and I would very gently bring it up. And I would give you an option of how I would like you to use it. I would not call you out on social media because you are not a big conglomerate who has a history of um, language abuses. Does that make sense? Like, I want people to kind of think about correcting people or raising awareness on different levels. So with friends and family or people who are pretty much equal in power to you, equal in influence, calling them in instead of calling them out is always the better way because you don't want to lose allies because of how you have handled something unskillfully yourself. So even if it's like a huge celebrity or a large organization, I would still look at their history. I would look at their actions and I would try to find a pattern, like how have they supported these various communities in the past? Because one error does not determine, does not make them a bad person or a bad company to work with. So I would also call them in. If they start to have a pattern of using language that perpetuates some type of harm, then calling out is a good option. But I want people to like kind of like pull back when you're talking to allies, when you're working with people. So earlier you asked me, have people like shown me resistance? The only emails I've gotten that objected to something on consciousstyleguide.com were from allies who thought that I did not take it far enough. And I thought, this is so interesting that allies are attacking me, but I have really heard nothing from people who, you know, you would think are not allies. And this bothers me because this exists in activist communities everywhere where you are fighting each other and not being able to build. There's no forward movement. And if there's no forward movement in activist communities, assuming that you have formed because you want to co create a different world, then that's a big problem. In the Conscious Style Guide, the book, I outline all these ways that we can collaborate so that we can communicate. Until we come to some kind of an agreement on what words mean, for example, we really can't build on that, right? We cannot say yes and, which is an old improv trick.
Yes, I know it well.
Yes, right? So people are saying no, 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 instead of saying yes, and we can also do this. And I want us to get to that yes and part.
Yes, I completely agree. Yes, and one of my favorite things on the world, first of all, because it keeps the door open and helps us move forward, as you say. Yes.
Exactly. What is not conscious is shutting down conversation, even with your so called enemies. If you shut down conversation, that does not allow anybody the opportunity to change their mind. And I believe that if we bring up language differences in a safer environment, then more minds feel safe to change.
Yeah. And you're really what you're describing to me. I mean, a lot of things, but one of the things I thought was you're asking people to show each other a little bit of grace.
Yes,
This person is not trying to attack you. This person is doing the best they can, and this is what they've got. and this is what you have, so find the connection.
Right, right. And, often when I think about people who don't believe in any kind of inclusive language, I actually think about some family members. And when I think about family members, suddenly I have more compassion. I have more love because I know them as real people. They're not just some person out there who is, using outdated language. They're actual people. And I urge people to, like, when we're thinking of that archetype, connect it to somebody who is real in your life, because then you can think, okay, well, they have also done this. So what might they be thinking? And by doing this, it opens me up to having conversations with people who are on the opposite side of what I am moving towards. But I'm so curious, like, why do you believe what you believe, And I want them to be curious about me. And I think the best way is to come together as individuals, as real people, instead of flattening each other into, oh, she's that conscious language person. I mean, I am.
Yeah.
But I come at it from a different perspective. I come from it from a very contextual and flexible perspective.
I love that. What you're saying here isn't really about language at all. I mean, language, I mean, it is, but it's about connection. It's about understanding that, like, use the language the best you can, but really you're trying to find the connections. I think about, and the words I know and the words that my students think are outdated. Like, I say you guys, and like, it's you all, I'm trying to say you all now because it's guys is not gendered to me, but it's gendered to them.
Yeah.
I wanted to bring up this idea and get your thoughts on when new words become imbued with old biases, right? Like, okay, well, let's shift the word, which you're not talking about words. I know we're not using X word anymore. We're using this word now. It's less offensive. And then that new word kind of takes on the same trappings of the old word. Then there's a next new word. And the way I see it is without the context and really getting at the issue, it's always going to be that way. But I would love to get your take on that.
Yeah, well, language changes.
Yeah.
Language evolves. I often compare language style to fashion style. It's very
Mm.
similar where things move in and out of like popularity. And why exactly? Well, we don't know. Why do some people seize upon a word or a certain outfit? We don't really know. But it's good to be aware of these evolutions because it informs which word we choose for our language. So I would say
Mhm.
that, like, I'm also a proponent of the gender-free guys because I also grew up saying guys, and I even call myself a guy. Like, when I have my hair in a ponytail, I call myself an IT guy. But I'm also queer. So maybe, like, I'm more comfortable calling myself a guy because I don't really think of myself as a woman. Like, I am, but I don't go around thinking that. So
Yeah.
guy works for me, guys works for me. But whether I use it or not to address an audience, it depends on the audience. If we're writing like a mainstream article, I don't think I would use guys without explaining it. So here's a key tip that I have in the Conscious Style Guide, which is you don't always have to ban words or get rid of words or make words uncool if you can explain it, right? Because even if it's a slur, like in your novel, if you make it meaningful and you give it a reason to be there, and there's an arc, not in just the person who used it, but the person who heard that word, maybe this word ripples through the community. Like, if that slur matters in the story, then you are not using it frivolously just to provoke a reaction, and you are not disrespecting your readers by assuming that they will understand that the character who used the slur is a jerk. You're also not assuming that people in the audience who are directly affected by this language, that they don't matter. You are treating your audience with respect. So that's how I deal with it. If I choose to use a word that may be considered sensitive, I build a bridge to it. I contextualize it. You could even have a content notice if you'd like. There's so many ways of using language consciously and flexibly so that you don't have to ban it. There are some exceptions. Like if you are writing a picture book and you only have 500 words for your story, you may not want to use a concept that requires a lot of explanation or justification. So you can say, well, let's not use the F word in a picture book, even though kids hear it all the time.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So context, context, context.
On the flip side of that, like, not a slur, but a word that maybe I, as, you know, a white presenting woman who likes to identify as Italian, I know. I think of this is kind of not exactly what you're talking about, but the opposite. There's a journalist, Julian Brave Noisecat, and he describes manifest destiny, which is the phrase I learned. He describes that as apocalypse. And that blew my mind when I first read it. I include that in the book where I interviewed you before. I would never use that word because that is not my understanding from my perspective.
Mhm,
But of course, that's the right word, right? Yes, of course, that was an apocalypse for the people who were affected by it, who experienced it.
mhm.
And so, this idea of this journalist providing context for me, and me again being curious enough and open enough to accept that, ruminate on it, and appreciate it and be thankful for it. That's also is the idea of bringing in these different perspectives from different groups so that we can understand how to use language to describe the same thing from different perspectives.
Right. And that's why I love variety. And you will probably not find me using the same word in every context. I'm a writer at my heart and my core. I was born creative and creating. I just happen to have been an editor for, over 3 decades for my profession. But your example, I really love how words have the power to crystallize an idea, to completely shift our perception about something. And that's why, first of all, it's important to choose more accurate words when we describe people. But it's also important to let people use all the words, like whatever you identify as. I want to hear your labels for yourself. Like every little bit is a clue for me to shape my perception of my world. So I welcome all the labels, all the self labels, I should say. Or actually, I do also welcome observer labels. Like sometimes I really love hearing a white American's experience of China, like and the language, because it's like, oh, they really put it in this way that I haven't thought about before, because I am more enmeshed in the Chinese language than they were, but they had this unique perspective. So I welcome that kind of discourse. And I want to avoid turning people away or discouraging them from these types of explorations. And I think that if we understand that we are amongst allies, I want there to be this kind of safety so that we can try things out, try new ideas out, try new concepts, just experiment with ways of communicating so that we can share ideas and spread ideas.
What are some other tips in your book that you want to call out here that you think would be really helpful for people?
I want people to understand that I don't think language heals all. We use we're changing language for equity because we're not most of us are not in a position in our lives where we have greater influence. We are not the ones who are changing the laws or changing the structures. So we have these tools within our reach, which are words. So that's why we have arguments over words, because these are the tools that are available to us. If things were different, if we had more power to change the course of, society, then I feel like there would be fewer arguments about words because we have better tools. So I'm noticing how the longer I work with words, the more I'm moving away from words and trying to achieve changes on higher levels So what does this mean? It means that by putting my energy toward higher level changes, including strategy, including like um, working with style guides to change their guidance, including working like writing to politicians. What this means is I don't have that much time for the little nitty gritty word things. So I may be missing out on, like I said, the latest things. I'm good with that because I'm creating change where change needs to happen. Instead of going through words, I'm going right there.
But you do need the words to make sure you connect with that audience. So it's also understanding to whom you're speaking, right?
If I had a choice between changing laws and changing words,
Yeah.
I would change the laws and then the trickle down from changing the laws would change more words faster. But, I think this is why we need allies with different backgrounds and different skill sets because I want to do this, but somebody else can work on a different level or in a different field or a different industry. Like we need all these approaches. This is what will make us strong. It will not weaken us. We need different perspectives. Like I'm coming from this contextual, flexible perspective because of what I'm noticing in my world, right? In the editing and writing worlds. So if you're coming from maybe from a scientific background or a legal background, you may have a different approach. I welcome it.
I believe that in my own life too. I really appreciate different perspectives. I've often thought of it in the idea of issues. Like I'm a big proponent of the First Amendment and of civic participation and animal rights. Those are and kids, those are my things. And if someone has different things, that's great because then we're all covering the things that need to be covered and we're bringing our ideas to the table.
Yeah.
And so what you're saying about like I don't know maybe all the legal or medical or whatever, or even you've got this like vast knowledge of style, but if we all come to the table, we can all sort of build the bridge together, right?
Yes. Yes. And, part of conscious language is inviting historically excluded voices into the conversation and getting more perspectives. I want, even if you are a white, non-disabled man, I want you to feel like you belong in this movement, like your perspective it matters to me. If you are an ally, I want to work with you. And I think that being inclusive of different voices and being welcoming and forgiving of people testing things out, I think that's the best way forward, Gina. I really believe that.
I do too. Thank you to my guest, Karen Yin, author of The Conscious Style Guide and founder and curator of theconsciousstyleguide.com. Music in this episode includes Spring Fling by Track Tribe and The Heist by Silent Partner. In addition to hearing News in Context every Friday at 8:30 a.m. and 6:30 p.m. on KSFP 102.5 in San Francisco, you can hear it on your favorite podcast channel. We're also on Facebook and Twitter at News in Context SF and on Instagram at News in Context. And you can find links to all of that at newsincontext.net. I'm Gina Valeria. Thank you for listening.